I despised my dad. As a child, I possessed a beloved plush toy, which I tenderly named Pepper. Pepper was my constant companion, accompanying me wherever I went. This doll held such a special place in my heart that I refused to let anyone separate us. My cousins delighted in making fun of me and engaging in keep-away games with her. However, I had a foolproof method for reclaiming Pepper. The moment I started to cry, the boys would immediately cease their antics. One evening, I accidentally left Pepper outside in the yard. It was after our meal that I realized I had forgotten my beloved doll outside. At that time, we were residing in a rural area. The darkness outside was absolute, akin to navigating through an unlit alley, uncertain of the menacing figures that might be concealed within. These lurking dangers could be anything from terrifying creatures to zombies and wild beasts brandishing sharp fangs. To compound the situation, ominous storm clouds were gathering overhead. My poor Pepper was at risk of being drenched by the impending downpour, but I wasn't worried. I had a plan. All I needed to do was shed some tears, confident that my dad would come to the rescue. Together, we would brave the menacing darkness and confront any lurking terrors. We would face the storm head-on and rescue my doll. After all, the sight of a girl in tears usually prompts action. Boys tend to capitulate to my wishes when I cry, but not my father. He surprisingly insisted that I should retrieve it myself. No matter how much I cried, wailed, and stomped my feet, my father remained unmoved. How could he be so heartless? Didn't he care for me at all? To add insult to injury, he even had the nerve to challenge me, saying, "If you love her so much, why did you leave her outside?" Before I had the chance to respond, he threw down the gauntlet. "If you truly care for your Pepper, you'll overcome your greatest fears to rescue her." Determined to prove him wrong, I stormed off to my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and spent the night weeping. My mother attempted to comfort me, and I could hear their raised voices echoing from downstairs. She understood the unwritten rule about how boys are supposed to react when girls cry. With each flash of lightning and boom of thunder, my heart shattered a little more. My father's refusal to retrieve Pepper made it clear he didn't love me enough. How could he not understand his duty? My affection for Pepper was undeniable. It wasn't my fault I had inadvertently left her outside. When dawn broke, my doll was nowhere to be found. Fine, I decided to ignore my father completely. I've observed my mother employing this strategy frequently. She would also mock my father while chatting with her friends on the phone, though I didn't grasp all of their conversations. At times, she even managed to banish him to the sofa during her bouts of rage. I was eager to master these skills. I was confident that, in time, my mother would pass down these tactics to me. As I ventured outside to search, she was nowhere to be found. It seemed the storm had swept her away. Tears began to flow once more. This time, however, my father noticed my distress. Approaching me, he inquired, "What happened?" I chose not to respond, instead opting to fold my arms and glare at him with a scowl, mimicking the angry look my mother often had. I thought perhaps it might have an effect, but it was to no avail. My father merely chuckled and instructed me to fetch the mail. I held my position firmly, determined not to be the butt of jokes as my cousins often made me. I aspired to emulate my mother, who simply had more experience in these matters. Yet my determination wavered when my father's voice boomed, instructing me to fetch the mail. The thought of facing his wrath, though he had never physically punished me, was enough to shake me. His voice alone carried a threat that I found deeply unsettling. So I made my way down the path lined with gravel to the mailbox, occasionally kicking stones and sulking, voicing silent wishes for my father to vanish or to endure an eternity in darkness alongside the monsters. In my heart, I lamented how little he understood the importance of my favorite stuffed toy and how lightly he took my feelings. As I neared the mailbox, my tears increased, yet they were not born of sorrow. They were tears of sheer happiness. Safeguarded from the previous night's downpour within the mailbox was my dear Pepper, unharmed. It remained intact. It wasn't misplaced. It was secure and once again cradled by me. I vowed to never allow such an event to recur. Repeatedly, I assured Pepper of my genuine love for her and my commitment to never overlook her presence again. My disdain for my father was profound. I quickly realized that tears had no effect on him, yet my mother persisted in her attempts. The shouting persisted, doors were slammed, and dishes shattered. The frequency of phone calls increased during my father's absence. Although I couldn't make out my mother's words, as she always spoke in hushed tones, her laughter was unmistakable. Moreover, she would abruptly end the calls whenever my father returned home. One evening, the house was devoid of any loud disputes or cries. No sobbing, no weeping. Mom quietly entered her bedroom, gathered a few belongings in her suitcases, and exited the home. A peculiar man in a red pickup was there to meet Mom outside. She tossed her luggage into the vehicle's rear, got into the passenger seat, and didn't glance back once. It was hard to grasp. Mom had departed. Who's going to show me how to navigate the intricate dance of sorrow? The same tactics she employed to relegate my father to the sofa. She was supposed to pass down all her wisdom to me. My dad spent many hours trying to convince me that my mom leaving wasn't because of me, explaining it was an issue between him and her. He assured me they both cared for me deeply, but needed time to work through their problems. I was so furious with him for causing my mom to leave that I retorted, "If you truly loved her, you conquer your greatest fears and go after her." Let me share a bit about my dad. To a child, he appeared as a towering figure. He embodied strength. Witnessing such a formidable figure crumble and weep alters one's perspective profoundly. My mom revealed his more vulnerable side. In her words, which she shared over the phone with a friend, he was a weakling. Despite being in the early stages of honing the skills my mother was known for, my living situation was dictated by my parents' separation, leaving me under my father's care. I fervently pleaded to be with my mother instead, considering my father to be far from strong. Moreover, I was curious to explore the extent of influence girls could wheedle over boys. However, my father, possibly out of malice, was adamant that I remain with him. He took measures to ensure that my mother was absent from any legal meetings, divorce discussions, or even when I had a chance to talk to the judge. He went to the extent of limiting my time with her to a single Christmas encounter. All of my friends who had gone through their parents' divorce seemed to revel in the holiday season. They boasted about enjoying not just one, but 2 Christmases. They shared tales of how one parent, ridden with guilt, would shower them in presents, whereas the other would compensate with fewer, albeit pricier, gifts. Why was this experience foreign to me? Why didn't I possess this leverage? The blame for this, in my eyes, squarely fell on my father. Had I been residing with my mother, I was certain I'd be navigating the joys of dual Christmases. My resentment towards my father grew deep. As I grew up and entered high school, the thought of homework filled me with dread. Attending classes felt like a chore, biology most of all. Can you imagine the revulsion of cutting open a worm? And the horror escalated when it came time to dissect a pig. The odor was brutally overpowering, reminiscent of stepping into the boys' locker room post-football drill. Why bother with anatomy? Why fuss over recessive genes and chromosomes? It's not as if these topics come up in everyday conversations. Fortunately, I found out that I wasn't alone in my feelings towards my parents. Others shared my intense dislike for their own. This realization opened up opportunities for me to be elsewhere, far from my father. Despite being aware of my friends' disdain for their parents, envy crept in due to their lavish living conditions. They resided in sprawling mansions, possessed the newest tech, computers, and more. Such luxuries were foreign to my father's way of living, fueling another layer of resentment towards him. His refusal to indulge in purchasing the trendy items I desired marked yet another personal disappointment. Dating was a nightmare for me. I once went out with a genuinely kind guy. His actions, from driving at breakneck speeds of almost 100 miles per hour to sneaking into forbidden areas, sent my pulse skyrocketing. The thrill and peril stirred a mix of terror and exhilarating adrenaline within me. Hence, when he kissed me, it was as if my entire universe was whirling. I felt like I was soaring, blissfully lost in ecstasy. This guy elevated me to realms beyond my imagination. My father had a knack for swiftly grounding my soaring spirits. As the boy and I arrived home, my father was there to greet us, conspicuously cleaning a pair of shotguns in the driveway. He insisted I go to my room while he had a word with my date. That was the end of that relationship. The incident scared off not just him but all potential suitors. They were too intimidated by my father to even consider dating me. I realized that sobbing on the staircase was futile. If I attempted to stay out late, you would simply come after me. This scenario was even more embarrassing than the shotgun display. It was unfathomable to me that my father would go to such lengths, effectively sabotaging my social life. He seemed to be projecting his own issues, stemming from my grandmother leaving him, onto me, and it felt incredibly unfair. There arrives a moment in a young person's life when they start seeing their parents in a new light. Confined to my room once again for breaking one of my dad's many rules, I chose to tackle the clutter in a closet. It was, after all, the designated spot for my apparel and footwear. Despite not owning the latest toys, gadgets, or tech that my peers flaunted, I took pride in my extensive wardrobe. While Walmart didn't carry the prestige of brands like Aeropostale or Abercrombie and Fitch, the appeal of purchasing 3 t-shirts for the cost of one was undeniable to me. Earning money was no easy feat, and I was determined not to squander it on trendy clothing that would soon be forgotten. Perhaps there was some wisdom in my father's advice after all. The closet was in a dire state, evidently neglected for ages, judging by the abundance of cobwebs adorning its corners. Perhaps abundance is an understatement, for the cobwebs were not just visible, but of the kind that clandestinely entangles itself in your hair, refusing to let go no matter how fervently you attempt to rid yourself of it. Among the relics of fashion that hung within, some outfits seemed as though they had been plucked out of a different era entirely, their style so outlandish it was hard to imagine they were once chosen as attire deliberately. As I sifted through these garments, relegating them to bags destined for donation, I stumbled upon a treasure trove of memories, including my parents' wedding album among other keepsakes. Flipping through the photo album, my mother appeared stunningly beautiful in her white wedding gown, despite the bygone fashion and hairstyles. Her gaze, filled with love for my father, was unmistakable. My father, typically averse to formal attire, was surprisingly dapper in his borrowed tuxedo. Each photo evoked memories of a time when my parents were united in love. However, much like the dimming colors of the photos and the dust settling on the album, those days are long past. Seeing my father in a state of happiness, so different from his recent demeanor, was striking. Since my grandmother's departure, his eyes lost their gleam and his step, its bounce. The rare moments I'd catch a spark in him were when I brought home any school award, no matter how trivial. He showed up to every event, supporting me in what seemed like an effort to perplex me thoroughly. Yet, as I viewed these photographs, I began to question if my perception had been clouded. Notably absent from these events was my mother. After setting the photo album aside, my eyes landed on a stash of letters. The box was overflowing, hinting at a treasure trove of love letters within. The depth of sentiment in these letters is striking, a stark contrast to today's digital expressions of love through Facebook statuses, tweets, or emojis. These letters were meticulously crafted, adorned with quaint artifacts known as stamps and postmarks, reminiscent of what my teachers described when they mentioned the Pony Express. It may have been just a month, but my love for you feels boundless. The way the sunlight dances in your hair and your smile brings warmth to my soul. I'm enchanted by your beautiful brown eyes. With a single word from you, I'd soar to the skies to fetch a star just for you. There's no length I wouldn't go to bring you your heart's desire. Your beauty stands unparalleled. The mere possibility of your love in return feels as legendary as the love of Aphrodite and Hephaestus. You are my Venus, my Juliet. I envision my life forever by your side. This snippet from one of my father's love letters illuminates the intensity and passion with which he wrote. Back then, my father was the epitome of a romantic. It makes one ponder, where did that enchantment go? What became of that initial spark? It seemed that these letters held a special place in my mother's heart, given the sheer number she had kept. But as I sifted through the envelopes in the other pile, observing the handwriting, I realized there was a stark contrast. The letters found at the bottom of the box were noticeably distinct. Their content was brief, focusing more on physical intimacy than the emotional connection. The language was crude, a far cry from the poetic declarations of love found earlier. Yet, the phrase "I love you" was still penned by the author. What reason could my mother have for holding on to these? Clearly, they weren't from my father. To complicate things further, these letters were marked with dates that came after my parents had married. What was going on? The initial batch of letters was filled with romantic and endearing words that could captivate any woman's heart. They were imbued with expressions of love and shared dreams. The subsequent collection, however, was harsh and offensive, concentrating on the crude and sensual. The numerous spelling and grammatical mistakes were almost unbearable. Yet, what truly shocked me was the latest find in the closet. Originating from a laboratory in California, the information in this letter was a turning point in my life. It altered everything, with one exception. My disdain for my father remained unchanged. How could he keep such a secret from me? But upon reflection, perhaps I shouldn't have been so surprised. My dad always kept his hair neatly trimmed, sporting a high and tight look with its dark brown hue. My mom, on the other hand, cherished her long brown locks that cascaded in soft curls down her back. Their wedding photos captured their brown eyes sparkling with a deep affection and joy. Perhaps my light blonde strands and blue eyes were simply the result of recessive traits, as explained in biology class. The revelation that I wasn't my father's biological daughter, as stated in an official document, left me reeling. How could he conceal such a significant truth? The thought that he might have coerced my mom into silence troubled me deeply. Realizing he wasn't my biological father after believing so for years felt like a betrayal. Despite all he had done for me, the fact he perpetuated this lie was unfathomable. He had always been dad to me. Now I was desperate for the truth, knowing I couldn't place my trust in someone who had kept this from me for so long. Locating my mom to uncover the truth became my mission. I wondered how she could ever tie the knot with someone as vile as my dad. Finding her proved more challenging than anticipated. I reached out to my grandparents, yet they hadn't laid eyes on her since her departure from my dad. My aunts and uncles appeared indifferent about her location. Just as I was about to lose hope, a police report in the newspaper caught my attention. It mentioned a domestic incident at a trailer park, listing my mom and an unidentified man. This could be my chance to get some clarity. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe, in some part of my mind, I hoped for a miraculous solution that would obliterate all the negativity in my life. I fantasized about my mother's place being a haven, a sanctuary from the darkness that seemed to engulf my home. Regrettably, the scene that greeted me was far from welcoming. The area in front of the trailer was cluttered with an assortment of dirt and rubbish. It left me wondering whether the owner was operating a salvage yard or had been perpetually hosting a garage sale for a couple of years. The lawn was a sad sight, with patches of dead grass interspersed with wildly overgrown areas. My dad would have been appalled at the sight. He took immense pride in his lawn, making this unkempt mess the complete opposite of what he considered acceptable. It seemed like a visual representation of chaos, far removed from any notion of home. My arrival must have caught my mother's attention because she was the first to approach me. Initially, there was a moment of mutual non-recognition. She had changed, her once natural hair now an unconvincing shade of blonde, the dark roots betraying her attempts at maintaining the facade. The tattoos that once seemed like a good idea had lost their appeal over time. Leaving my father had given her a newfound sense of freedom, it seemed. Recognition dawned on her face as she realized who I was, and she embraced me, the scent of nicotine clinging to her. But our emotional reunion was brief. Without hesitation, I confronted her with the question that had been burning inside me. Who was my father? Initially, she attempted to deceive me by claiming that the man I had always known as my father was indeed my biological dad. But when I presented her with the results from a California lab, her expression soured, and she reluctantly admitted that my real father was an error in judgment. She confessed her love for the man I grew up with and described my biological father as just some man she encountered at the diner where she was employed. Their affair spanned about a year until he abruptly vanished from town, never to return. It was around this time that a man, characterized by his receding hairline and protruding belly, emerged from the trailer. While my biological father might have been a lapse in judgment, standing there, I realized my choice of summer attire was an even greater misstep. This repulsive individual ogled me as though I were merely an object. Was this the person for whom my mother abandoned my dad? Overwhelmed by nausea, I fled the scene, and just like my mother, I never once glanced back. I despised my father. Yet I encountered a young man who survived the intimidating shotgun cleaning talk and withstood all my father's tests to ensure his intentions were pure and that he cherished me for my essence, not just my looks. This young man was the one who could send my pulse racing, not merely from fleeting moments, but from the meaningful times we shared. The other guys from whom my father shielded me ended up with girlfriends who became pregnant before graduation. A few attempted to embrace fatherhood, yet the majority fled from their duties. This young man stood apart. He even gained my father's respect by asking for my hand in marriage. However, the question remains, who will escort me down the aisle? Who will present me at my wedding? Who will be the last to grasp my hand before I take the name Mrs. Rogers Hall? I cannot turn to my biological father, for his identity is unknown to me. Nor can I consider my mother's partner, or whoever he might be, as the mere thought repulses me. No, it has to be my father who entrusts me to my future husband. My dad brought me up as if I were his very own. His love for me was as deep as if we shared the same blood. He showered me with affection and provided me with everything a child could wish for. He looked past my mother's mistakes because of his profound love for her, believing in her apologies despite her infidelities. He imparted to me the crucial distinctions between love and mere desire. He emphasized that true love is without conditions, yet it must be mutual. He instilled in me the belief that one should be willing to go to great lengths for their loved one, provided the feeling is reciprocated. Furthermore, my father enlightened me about the difference between merely existing and truly living. He taught me that moments in the present are fleeting, disappearing before we fully grasp them. Yet, life shared with someone you love can enrich your existence for a lifetime. Some in the town whispered that my father was feeble and dishonored, yet in my eyes, he embodied strength far surpassing any of my mother's paramours. Consider a man who embraces a child not of his blood as his own, showering her with love as if she were his greatest treasure. That man is my father. My disdain for my father is profound, rooted in the sorrow that he passed away before I could express my deep love for him, before I could acknowledge my eternal gratitude for the life lessons he imparted. It's my desire to add a hyphen to my surname, a testament to the world that I am, above all, my father's proud daughter. I love you so much, Dad. Camilla Rogers stepped down from the podium, her eyes brimming with tears, and fell into a weeping heap at the foot of her father's casket. Simon Hall, her betrothed, was quick to envelop her in a comforting embrace, offering solace amidst her sorrow. It was in this moment of profound understanding that he fully embraced her wish to keep her father's name alongside hers. The usual chatterboxes, infamous for spreading tales of Liz Rogers' romantic escapades and Jeremy Rogers' perceived inaction, cast their eyes down, engulfed in remorse. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft utterance of "Amen" by the clergyman.